Thank you, everyone, for taking time on this Saturday afternoon to attend this important forum on the challenges facing human rights in the present period. The problem of advancing and defending human rights and civil liberties is not a new one. However, it did take on added dimensions in the aftermath of the events of September 11th, 2001, as governments around the world responded to what George Bush called the war on terror. We hope that this will be an informative afternoon and one which we, whether as activists or members of the broader community, can use to meet the challenge of defending human rights and civil liberties against the increasing pressure to limit and truncate them in the name of making the world safe and secure. Before proceeding, I would like to thank those who have made today possible. First, I want to thank and acknowledge Jeffrey Brown of the University of Winnipeg Students Association. They have provided us with the use of the Bowman Center, the childcare space, refreshments, publicity, the sound, and other equipment we are using today. So please give an applause to Jeffrey Brown and the University of Winnipeg Students Association. Thank you very much. We would also like to thank the West Central Women's Resource Center for providing us with the qualified childcare minders that are available today. And in preparing the forum, we have also received the support of many organizations. Their actions to endorse this event are an important indication of the concern the community has about this issue and will serve the community well in developing this work further. And I would like to list them. So bear with me, but I think it's important that we say who everyone is that made this afternoon a success. Peace Alliance Winnipeg, the University of Winnipeg Students Association, Canadian Dimension Magazine, the Canadian Tamil Congress, Winnipeg, the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, the Canadian Federation of Students, Manitoba, Project Peacemakers, Winnipeg, the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Movement, Manitoba-Cuba Solidarity Committee, CUPE Manitoba, Independent Jewish Voices, Winnipeg, Winnipeg Labour Council, the National Association of Japanese Canadians, the Canada-Haiti Action Network, Citizens Concerned About Deep Integration, and Grassroots Women Manitoba. So if a round of applause, I think, for all these organizations who have stepped forward to help build this forum today. Many of them, if not all of them, have display tables here today, and please, there will be time at the end of the afternoon to take in the display tables, look and see the information they've brought here. And I'd also like to thank Peace Alliance member Paul Graham, who undertook the many hours of work to prepare this forum. Thank you, Paul. During the course of the afternoon, probably near the start of when the panelists are speaking, we're going to be circulating a sign-up sheet for the Peace Alliance Winnipeg. That would put you on our mailing list, and it obligates you to do nothing more than to receive emails from the Peace Alliance Winnipeg. And it's not an open list, so you won't be barraged by emails coming from all kinds of different people. You'll approximately once every 2 weeks receive news and update from the Peace Alliance Winnipeg. We're also encouraging people to take out memberships today if they're interested in the Peace Alliance Winnipeg, and our table is in the back corner there. We have a brochure explaining what we're all about, our work, and on that brochure is an application form. We are also, as I was indicated to, collecting for an action in Calgary this week. They've asked people to bring, George Bush is coming to Calgary. And peace activists in Calgary are planning a welcome, and part of the welcome is they want to collect shoes to somehow throw at George Bush, or symbolically throw at George Bush. I'm not sure. The full information about the action in Calgary is on our website, and if anybody wants, they can tell us when they can drop us off their shoes. It would have to be in the next couple of days, and we'll send them out there. Lastly, before actually moving to our panelists, I want to inform you of the passing of Gordon McDermott on March 3rd after a lengthy illness. Gordon was known to many of you because of his concern for peace and social justice. Gordon was a founding member of the Peace Alliance Winnipeg in 2005. He worked on the plans to reorganize the Peace Alliance out of the No War Coalition, and he was on its executive at the time of his death. The work of creating a world that respects human beings, their human and social rights, their right to live in peace, and on terms that they determined was very important to him. And I'm sure he would have been very pleased that this forum has been organized. He will be sorely missed for his insights, his readiness to help in the task at hand, his good humor, and his friendliness to all. His memorial service will be on Tuesday, March 10th at 11 a.m. at St. Mary's Road, at St. Mary's United Church, 613 St. Mary's Road. So now, without more, now to the forum. And I'll just explain the format before I get into introducing our panelists. Each member of the panel will be given 10 minutes for speaking remarks. And our timers, just so the panelists will notify you when 5 minutes has passed and when you have 5 minutes left, when 2 minutes are left, and when 1 minute remains in your allotted time. And we will ask you to be firm on this in the interest of moving the afternoon along. Audience questions, once all the panelists have presented, will be taken, questions and comments, and we'll ask you to hold them to 30 seconds in the interest of creating maximum time for discussion. And again, we'll be firm on that. We ask you to say who you are, and we ask everyone to be respectful of the meeting today in terms of their comments and how they direct them. And now to how we asked our panelists to prepare for the forum. We presented them with, to focus their comments with 4 questions that they should consider. First one, what impact has 9/11 and the war on terror had on Canadians? Second question, have these events influenced your political outlook? If so, how? Third question, have they shaped your activism? If so, how? And lastly, how best can we defend and extend human rights in a post-9/11 environment? So these were the questions we presented. The speaking order is going to be as you see it, and let me just introduce the panelists to you. Michael Welch, to my immediate left. Michael is a peace activist who has shown leadership in organizing support in Winnipeg for American war resistors who are fighting deportation to the United States. He is active in citizens concerned about deep integration and the Peace Alliance Winnipeg, and is the local chapter contact for the Council of Canadians. To his left is Lesley Hughes. Lesley is a well-known journalist and broadcaster with a long history of community activism in Winnipeg. She was a recipient of the YMCA-YWCA Woman of Distinction Award. Lesley is author of We Choose Canada, a columnist for Canadian Dimension magazine, and host of Alert Radio. Next to her is Colleen Simard. Colleen is a filmmaker, a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, and founder and publisher of Urban NDN, a newspaper she founded in 2008 that offers a fresh journalistic voice from, for, and about Aboriginal people in Winnipeg. Next to her, Shahina Siddiqui. Shahina is Executive Director of the Islamic Social Services Association Canada and a frequent commenter on Islamic and human rights issues in Canada and the United States. She sits on the advisory board of CARECAN, the Canadian branch of the Council of American Islamic Relations, and principal author of Women-Friendly Mosque and Community Centers, Working Together to Reclaim Our Heritage. Last is Anthony Hall. Anthony is founding coordinator and professor of globalization studies at the University of Lethbridge and author of The American Empire and the Fourth World, which Naomi Klein has described as an overflowing toolbox filled with little-known stories, legal arguments, and fresh ideas that, if used properly, could change the world. So that is our panelists, and I would ask Michael to begin with his presentation.
Thanks, Glenn, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Michael, and I am an activist. That sounds like something you hear at an AA meeting, isn't it? Although there is a sense that maybe being part of Activists Anonymous might be not be a bad move in this heightened age of post 9/11 security consciousness that we see around us. It's almost something that we are being made to feel ashamed of. As I continue, I'd like to try to paint a bit of a portrait of this post 9/11 world that we're living in, and hopefully try to process the 4 questions that Glenn put to us through that lens of my own research and experience. In June of 2006, 17 Muslim men were arrested after Canada's security establishment determined that they were part of a plot to attack facilities in Toronto, kidnap parliamentarians, and even behead the Prime Minister. In addition, the police, as they were performing the arrests, did the media the courtesy of informing them well in advance so that the story would get full exposure, and well in advance of coming votes on the extension of the anti-terrorism legislation and a renewed vote on the mission in Afghanistan. The RCMP and CSIS even had a full press conference to provide journalists the story of homegrown terrorists, and sure enough, much of the follow-up commentary by Canada's leading opinion setters and pundits came out with stories about how Canada had lost its innocence, and the war on terrorism has come home, and so on and so forth. It is curious, though, that a media ban had been imposed to prevent the press and lawyers from getting more detailed information about the exact nature of this threat. What we do know is that the police had been monitoring their communications for some time and entrapped them into purchasing this ammonium nitrate that it is argued could have been used to make a bomb. And it turns out that this incident is a replay of an incident from the summer of 2003 where 24 Muslim men were arrested and detained for months, only to discover the police had nothing on them. No evidence, no Al-Qaeda sleeper cell, no weapons, no elite connections of any kind. And beyond damaging the reputations and most probably ruining the lives of these individuals, these actions have had the impact of creating a climate of fear and intimidation. And they've been used as an excuse to ramp up police powers and militarism. And the media has played a crucial role in fostering this culture of militarism and extreme security provisions. So we're seeing here, I'll just mention one more case that I downloaded from Global Research from last summer. Headline, U.S. peace and civil rights activists added to database of terrorist suspects. Undercover Maryland state troopers infiltrated 3 groups advocating peace and protesting the death penalty, attending meetings and sending reports on their activities to U.S. intelligence and military agencies, according to documents released Thursday. The documents show the activities occurred from at least March 2005 to May 2006, and that officers used false names, which the documents refer to as covert identities, to open email accounts to receive messages from the groups. Also included in the 46 pages of documents obtained by the Maryland chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit is an account of an activist's name being entered into a federally funded database designed to share information among state, local, and federal law enforcement agencies on terrorist and drug trafficking suspects. The ACLU attorney, David Roca, said state police violated federal laws prohibiting departments that receive federal funds from maintaining databases with information about political activities and affiliations. The activist was identified as Max Oboszewski. His primary crime was entered into the database as terrorism, anti-government. His secondary crime was listed as a terrorist, anti-war protesters. The database is known as the Washington-Baltimore high-intensity drug trafficking area. This is not supposed to happen in America, said Mr. Roca. In a free society which relies on engagement of citizens in debate and protest and political activity, to maintain that freedom, you should be able to attend a meeting about an issue you care about without having to worry that government spies are entering your name into a database used to track alleged terrorists and drug traffickers. We're seeing authoritarian measures being introduced that are having the impact of intimidating Muslims, intimidating people who are engaged in peaceful activism, and other people who are marginalized in other ways. And this is directly in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks, but they did not originate at that time. In fact, some of these measures were introduced before 9/11 and simply pulled off the shelf. And we have it from well-documented authority that efforts, even in the Clinton era, to roll back posse comitatus, which prevents the militarization of civilian institutions, have been contemplated and begun before then. They simply had the means. With 9/11, we found that there was an increased willingness on the part of the public to embrace measures they probably would not otherwise embrace. So we have this legislation which is very much mirrored in Canada of the Patriot Act, which with all of the various provisions that allow for things like unprecedented that allow the checks and balances that they're supposed to protect citizens are being rolled back. Things like habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus in certain terrorist cases are not present. So when you have this legislation mirrored in Canada with the Anti-Terrorism Act, and they were told it's supposed to protect citizens from an all-powerful enemy, devious and diabolical enough to undermine protocols and infrastructure set up to protect us from terrorism and other threats. So in order to address this, we have to contemplate that the fear of terrorism has, to a certain extent, had the effect of curtailing dissent. Activists are increasingly feeling that, I can look at my own experience. Not too long ago, I went to Folklorama, where Stephen Harper was supposed to be speaking, and these 3 police officers approached me, and they wanted to ask for my identification, and they wanted to search my bag, while other people were going in. And the officer in question said that they recognized me from some past event. So essentially what I'm saying here is I was profiled. And I was profiled because I've engaged, I've never done anything. Okay, maybe I jaywalked a couple of times, but I have no criminal record of any kind. I've just simply taken some positions that may dissent from where, that could brand me as being some kind of a threat to the state and what the government wants to do. So in addition to these measures, we've seen the rise of biometrics, radio frequency identifier chips encoded with people's private information and security details. It's already in use in passports and now the new enhanced driver's licenses. The Council of Canadians, among other civil advocacy groups, have warned that there is no guarantee that people's private information, once in the hands of U.S. authorities, will be protected. More likely, it will lead to the creation of a North American surveillance society, where people's movements can be tracked and monitored in some cases. People will be profiled and subjected to even greater intrusions in their personal lives. From Salem to McCarthy to autocratic regimes around the world, we've seen how witch hunts damage the lives of innocent people, all in the name of protecting the community. And that we must take away our liberties in order to save our freedoms. My view as an activist is the way this has had an impact, it's caused me to look deeper into the threats that we are facing as society. It's not just a question of left versus right. We're looking at how we are all under threat. And we have to be very vigilant now. We have to recall that authoritarian regimes rely on the fear and compliance of the regular public to foster these things. So it's very important that when it comes to when people dissent, that they be protected. When people, whether Muslim or Aboriginal peoples or anyone else who's where the authoritarian entities are encroaching, we have to be there. We have to act collectively to try to safeguard for all of us. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll get some good questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Our chair has said that we had 10 minutes. I have it in writing. I have in my possession, an email which says I had 12. And so I have edited this carefully to 12, but I've cut some stuff out, and so hope to come in at 10. And my thanks as well to everyone who helped to organize today. I want to use my time to show you that Canada's freedoms have always been more fragile than we realize, and that they are post-11 close to a breaking point, and that all of us, as Michael has just said, need to be more vigilant and responsive than we have been for some time. Today's conversation is a very difficult one to host because it challenges the very powerful in a very fundamental way. But Winnipeg is an appropriate place to have it because, ready or not, this city is on its way to becoming an icon of human rights. On the other hand, Manitoba's own history is replete with racism and sexism. Louis Riel, now perceived as the father of Manitoba, suffered wide-scale discrimination because of his race, his religion, and his language. He was half-breed, he was Catholic, he spoke French, and he was vilified, especially by Canada's elite Eastern establishment, for all of these. While it's true that Manitoba women were indeed the first women in Canada to get the vote, that was for white women only, and Native and immigrant women waited till the 60s. If we look carefully at Canada's reputation for righteousness, we may not, in fact, like what we see. It's little known that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted by a Canadian, no less, was introduced for the first time at the UN in 1948, Canada, along with the Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia, refused to sign it. Speaking for the government of Louis Saint Laurent, Foreign Affairs Minister Lester Pearson explained, this was because the federal government could not make a legal commitment on behalf of the provinces. In truth, he knew perfectly well that no legal commitment was required. Their fear, human rights scholar William Schabas has discovered the truth here, the real truth, when Canada's National Archives were opened decades later. He uncovered cabinet notes which revealed that a handful of far-right ministers had doubts about both freedom of religion and freedom of expression. Their fear at the time was that freedom of religion would extend to Jehovah's Witnesses and to British Columbia's Doukhobors, who favored public nakedness on some occasions, and the horrors that might lead to. It was also feared that freedom of expression would include communists and trade unionists, and all that implied during the Cold War. In fact, Saint Laurent was appeasing those opinions, and Pearson took his instructions from his prime minister. Schabas told me this in an exclusive interview here at the University of Winnipeg. Schabas suspects that a similar scenario explains why Canada refused to ratify the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples in June of 2006, a position shared only by Russia, and one which shocked the international community coming from Canada. Perhaps nobody typifies the Canadian conflict around human rights better than Tommy Douglas, whose experience suggests that even in Canada, a champion of the people can be considered an enemy of the state. One of Canada's most respected and beloved political figures, the little guy who fought for the right of Canadians to free quality health care, he was at the same time the subject of lifelong, intense, and relentless surveillance by the country's national police force. We can only be glad that the Mounties didn't have tasers at the time. So when it comes to human rights, the real Canada is at odds with its self-righteous image. We have a sentimental attachment to the protection of human rights, but we falter in their exercise, and not just in our failures to protect Jews fleeing Nazis during World War II, or in our many failures with respect to our Aboriginal population, to name a couple of the big ones. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is only 8 pages, but I think they're the most important and certainly the most beautiful 8 pages that we have produced in our history, because the Charter is about safety, the safety that makes progressive change and growth possible. The language is plain. We're guaranteed freedom of conscience. It solemnly and specifically promises our freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. It describes those freedoms as fundamental, the freedoms they are that make Canadians the envy of much of the world's people. In any discussion of Canadian rights and freedoms, you have to remember the quivering jowls and the wobbling voice of John Diefenbaker, the crusty 13th Prime Minister of this country. He was proudly Canadian long before Molson's breweries dreamed up their iconic Joe, the cool Canuck of the Great White North. Dief was famous for saying, among other things, "I am Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think is right, free to oppose what I believe is wrong." John Diefenbaker's eloquence may have described the free Canadian of his day, but that was almost a half a century ago. My personal experiences during the election of 2008 suggest that Dief's free Canadian may be a museum piece. I have found it helpful, I don't know why, to think clearly about this trauma in my life by imagining that it happened to somebody else, somebody more important. And here I ask for your indulgence. Let's look briefly at those events as if they happened not to me, a mere middle-aged woman from Obscuria, but to some other Canadian, possibly a young man in southern Ontario, where, according to the media, important things happen to important people. In the fall election, that young man was one of 1,600 or so candidates running for Parliament. On September 26th, he was suddenly accused of a thought crime. As punishment, he was declared unfit for public office with all the attendant damages to his spirit, to his reputation, to his family, and to his future. His alleged crime had occurred 6 years earlier in a column he wrote in his practice as a journalist. He was accused of suggesting that the terrorist bombings of New York City on September 11, 2001 were an inside job. He allegedly blamed the world's Jews for being complicit in those attacks and for allowing 3,000 innocent people to die as a result of their silence. There was no investigation into the charges or into the anonymous bloggers who initiated them. These charges branded the candidate an anti-Semite and politically extreme, and they were repeated for several days in the mainstream media venues all across Canada, about 500 newspapers, several radio and TV networks. They were also published and broadcast in the major dailies in China, Israel, the United Kingdom, and the US. The candidate maintained that the charges were false, a claim his entire body of work supported, but in this Canada of 2008, they did not need to be true. The charges by themselves were enough to disqualify him from contributing to the political life of the country. He wanted to contribute, he was qualified to contribute, but it wasn't going to happen. For him and for his supporters, the race was over. His crime was, in fact, a journalistic crime. He had reported previously published information on worldwide challenges to the official story of 9/11, a story his conscience told him was important that Canadians understand. We should note that even if the candidate had written or believed the simplistic and provocative statements attributed to him, he would have been innocent of any crime, provided he did so without malice or any incentive to hatred or violence. The fact is, he did not. Those who collaborated in charging him with his thought crime denied the candidate his freedom of conscience, his freedom of thought, belief, and freedom of opinion. And this is also deeply alarming. The media who failed to investigate the charges, who instead repeated and recycled them, denied the candidate freedom of expression and apparently, without a second thought, thereby undermined their own. Whether the candidate was male, female, Gentile, Jewish, white, or otherwise, from central Canada, the Maritimes, or the West Coast, matters not. With an enthusiasm that approached drooling and following an anonymous blogger, Canada's media first trashed the candidate and then disappeared him. Not so on the internet. if you search the candidate there, you'll certainly find him and his legacy. He's a liar, a crook, a bigot, a common moonbat, best known for being batshit crazy forever. So much for John Diefenbaker's free Canadian, eh? The candidate's experience obliges us to ask, is this the freedom of which Canadians are so proud? Is this the environment in which we can move forward with confidence? And also this, is it possible that we have been so careless with our freedoms that we have failed to notice that they slipped away? There are lots of things that we can do, so let's talk about it while we can. Thank you.
Does this work? Can you hear me? Yeah? Well, I was really happy to be invited here to speak to you all, to be part of this group of people sitting here. Anine, my name's Colleen Samard. I don't think of myself as an activist. I think I was telling a photographer friend I met earlier here, I'm not an activist in the work I do, I think. But I was sitting here and I was listening to Michael and I was listening to Lesley, and I've been giving this question some thought, and how has my life changed since 9/11 and 9/11, and so I'm a storyteller. So I'm going to tell you a couple stories. I'm going to tell you 2 stories anyway. So I write this column for the Free Press, and I don't work at the Free Press. I work at home. It's a lonely job. I sit at my computer and tap away and email my story off, and all of a sudden on Saturday it's in the paper, and there it is. But I follow the news, and I love Aboriginal issues. That's why I wanted to be a journalist, is because of Aboriginal issues. So a couple of years ago, I heard about Caledonia, and it was all over the news, and they're burning piles of tires and stuff like that. And I remembered when Oka happened, and I was 18. I was 17, 18, and I was in my last year of high school, and I wanted to go to Oka. I wanted to go so bad, but I wasn't 18 yet, and and my first year of university, and I had to do this and that, and I so regretted not going to Oka. So Caledonia happened, and I'm sitting at my computer, and my son's in school, and I phoned my friend, my relative who's half Mohawk, and he's in his 60s, and I say, let's go to Caledonia. So we went. We went to Caledonia, my son, my relative, and myself, and we just drove. We had no idea what to do, but we wanted to be there. Here's our people, and the smoke cloud in the sky was almost like a call of warning, come and help us. I saw it in a totally different perspective than a lot of people saw it. Oka happened, and those guys were villains to a lot of people. They were scary, eh? That scary Indian persona, the warrior, the evil Indian warrior, eh? But I saw them as, strong men. So we went to Caledonia, and wow, it was a big surprise. It was like a little community had sprung up on this land, and it was cold and it was muddy, and we had a tent, and we were trying to set it up, and people wanted us to come stay at their house, off the land, and there was a kitchen set up. We didn't have to cook or go get food because they were feeding us, and it was just this little community, and the majority of people there were women and some kids, teenagers, and these planes kept flying overhead, and I had a cell phone. I took my boyfriend's cell phone, and I don't know, it just didn't work that well. I don't know. But I came back to Winnipeg after that. I had to come back after, about a week, and reading this stuff and seeing it through the media. I wrote about it too. I wrote about my perspective and being there and kind of being scared at that there was one night where we were all at the border, and all these people from the town were there, and all of us were there, and there was yelling and swearing, but it was just a different look at what it was. I don't know. So I want to tell you another story about an activist, because I don't consider myself an activist, but I've gotten to meet a few of them. One guy I met last year, I think, was James Ward. He was part of this conflict in Burn Church in the East Coast a few years ago, several years ago. He is an activist, and he was part of this group called the West Coast Warriors now. He's out in BC that way. And a few years ago, he made the news, national news, because these warriors had been stopped on a bridge in BC somewhere, and they had a truck, or a van. They had a van, and they had some guns. And so they were pulled over by the police and they were arrested. And from what he told me, I'm paraphrasing him now because I sat down and just hung out with him for a while. He said, they arrested him and they took him somewhere, and the media got the story, but they only got one side of the story because, those guns were registered. They were bought legally. They were bought so that these guys could have they were taking them to a camp. They were going to teach kids about hunting, because hunting for Indigenous people, that's a skill. We're people of the land. We need to know how to do these things. So, when Paul Graham phoned me to be here, I told him, hey, I'm not an activist. I'm just me, and I'm just an Aboriginal writer. But I thought about James Ward's story, and I told him that, after 9/11, us as Indigenous people, the activists out there who are out there fighting for their rights are getting muzzled, James Ward is probably, I don't know, I'm guessing here again, right? This is my opinion. He's probably on some list, some terrorist site, some terrorist list that, he's against Canada. He's a risk. But really, he's trying to defend his Indigenous rights, and how can we move forward as a people, as Indigenous people? How can we fight for our rights? I'm not talking about treaty rights. Those are different. Indigenous rights, rights of sovereignty, that we're the first people of this land. How can we fight for that if we're labeled terrorists? And that really troubles me, and I'm looking and I'm watching, 2010 is not far away, the Olympics in BC, and I worry about our people, our Indigenous warriors out there, and they're not evil. They're trying to fight for their rights, but they get demonized and they get treated like terrorists when, like Michael said, like Lesley said, it's who has the power and who uses it and who gets to say who's a terrorist and who's not, So I just want to share those stories with you. I guess, what can you do? What can I do? Just question it, I started my paper because it's a pro-Aboriginal paper. I try to be apolitical and just be pro-Aboriginal. I think that's what's needed. We need to give these people a voice, these Indigenous leaders. We need to listen to them and respect them. Miigwech. Thank you.
Miigwech.
First, let me greet you all with the greeting of Islam. Peace be with all of you. I'm sitting here and thinking, where do I start? Because it's so much to say and so much to bring to your attention. However, I'll just speak from the heart and tell you what post 9/11 has meant for my community and myself, and how things have changed. before 9/11, I was a Canadian, like anyone else. Yes, I looked different and I dressed different, and there were curiosity about that, but I was still part of Canada. Post 9/11, I have become the other, and so has my community. We are constantly defending, we are constantly explaining, we are constantly trying to prove our Canadianness, whatever that means. And that is a burden that we carry. And I guess perhaps, like one of my friends, Rabbi, told me, he said, this is your turn. Every community in Canada has gone through this. However, I do question, and I think we must question, now that I'm a grandmother and a third generation of my family is Canadian. My outlook has changed from just attacking and just questioning to actually being part of the change. And that is very important for us to know. When people complain about what's happening from the powers to be, and I was questioned in one of the classes at the university, and how this government, that government is doing, and so forth. And I turned to them and I said, how many of you voted in the last elections? Only 2 hands went up. So it's easy, perhaps sometimes, to look, as I said, I was the other, looking at the other and saying what was wrong, but I think as citizens we need to get involved. I think what brought to my attention after 9/11 was that I was a citizen of this country. I chose to be part of this country, to adopt this country as my home, and the responsibility also laid on my shoulders. Of course, do not excuse what's going on, and I see that post 9/11, the first interview that I had, and I think Donald was interviewing us, was this right away a red flag went up in my head because suddenly the evil side of Islam was mentioned. And I'm sitting there saying, okay, versus what? Evil side of Christianity and Judaism? And it's so quickly, the whole scenario was framed in the context of religion that it really kind of shook me. And then slowly and gradually, if you see the progression from that point onwards, because for some it was a very good way to address their own concerns by saying, look, you guys are now victim of Islam. Well, we have been for the last 60 years of the Muslim terrorist, right? So it became a context that they could now play up about what they were experiencing in their country. The second thing that I noticed was from the feminist perspective, and I don't put all the feminists in one basket, but from a certain very vocal part of the feminist group was suddenly about this Muslim woman who's oppressed, repressed, suppressed, and depressed, and how she needed to be, and a mindless creature who needed to be told what was good for her without being asked. The third was from the media, which suddenly was chest thumping of how we believed in freedom of expression, as long as that expression valued what you valued, but dare not question what you value. And now they had a villain, and so somebody to beat up with and somebody to put up, and have these sensational stories about. The fourth area that I found there was a lot of giddiness in was the so-called social activists who were suddenly, because remember, when we say activist, we are not saying that all activists have this very, there are activists on the left, on the right, everywhere, with their own agendas. And so we had this Sharia tribunal, faith-based tribunal discussion in Ontario, which went crazy and out of hand. and everybody was trying to outdo each other as to who could bash Islam the strongest and the bestest. And that was people from within the community, but nobody was asking, well, what is Sharia? Everybody became an expert. So an industry grew around 9/11, the anti-Islam, anti-Muslim industry. So if today you want to be popular, if you want to be the best writer or just write something against Islam and Muslims. And this is it. It will guarantee your success. Nobody will ask you if, how your grammar is, how your composition is, how good a writer you are, as long as that is. So it was quite an awakening call for myself and my community. Not to say that things are not bad in so-called Muslim countries, or that some people interpret Islam the extreme way, or that there is a lot of debate and critique that needs to take care. However, if it is done in the context where there is very little information and that the information is really misinformation, when it is seen as fashionable, it is seen as acceptable, when our ministers can stand up and say anybody who is, Muslims and Arab organizations that are critical of Israel, their funding will be cut. And we all remain quiet as to, okay, yeah, it's Muslims, that's fine. When sessions are held in Winnipeg that talk about developing human intelligence, and when our first respondents are trained by ex-CIA agents who tell them how to profile Muslims, what questionnaires to ask, and is attended by 200 of our police and our hydro and our EMTs, and the one who brings it to the attention of the authorities, an editorial is put in the Winnipeg Free Press, which is myself, naming myself as somebody who's brought a frivolous complaint against them. And you think, like, what the heck is going on? When booklets are being distributed on the streets of Winnipeg, free of charge, talking about all the ills of Islam and how Islam is there and Muslims are there to kill everyone, and how they're anti-Canadian, anti-democracy, and you name it, and you bring it to the attention of the police and the Department of Justice, which comes around and tells you that it's very stupidly written. It's not a work of an intelligent person, so it doesn't really pose a danger. Okay? So I guess all that happened in Rwanda with all those stupid people going on radio and calling the cockroaches and so forth, or what happened in other times of history, because they were stupid, we didn't take them seriously. But we know the result of it. So I think when Lesley and my other friends were talking about being conscious of what is going around you, to be asking the questions, because I don't have the answers. I can just point you to what is happening, the change that is taking place. It is very subtle. Mr. Obama's administration just said, we are not going to review what happened in the time of Mr. Bush's administration. We are going to move forward. How are you going to move forward unless you know what happened and how systemically it has already penetrated all through the justice and all kinds of systems? And that is my concern again here, is that if we are not conscious of what has systemically penetrated already, the anti-Muslim, the anti-Islam, the anti-dissent, attitude within our justice system, within our policing system, within our political system, our educational system, our social systems, how are we going to correct and move forward? So what can we do? My guess is as good as yours. I ask you, most of you know more than I, is how do we really bring back or perhaps charter a new course, And I usually tell people is that I'm not concerned with whether you agree with my faith or not, whether you agree with my choices, but you must stand up for my choices, because that's what Canada is about. And so we can have a debate and we can disagree, but if we do not stand up for each other, unfortunately, we are headed for trouble. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tony Hall, Anthony Hall, and I'm very pleased to be here with this esteemed panel. Colleen, I've been hearing about you, and I was at Caledon myself and talked with Don Smith and Jamie Jameson, who actually got it going, maybe a little younger than you or your age. It was, clan mothers. I was in court one day. Don Smith looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, you own land in the Haldeman tract area. You're in a conflict of interest." The judge went back and then decided he was not in a conflict of interest. The judge himself decided in a ruling if he was in a conflict of interest. I had never seen anybody look a judge in an eye and say, "Your Honor, you don't have jurisdiction here." And this is Winnipeg, and I've been in Winnipeg lots over the years, and there has been a kind of silence around the Lesley Hughes affair, and I don't have to talk about Lesley Hughes as a Southern Ontario male politician who was essentially, could I say raped? Maybe that's a bit over the top, but she was assaulted intellectually, ideologically in the public square, and I did not read too many things about it, and I wrote about it, and I did the research. I call it a clash of conspiracy theories was the article I wrote. It was in the National Post, and there was all kinds of attention on it. When I talk about Winnipeg, back in 1990, leading up to 1990, I worked with Izzy Asper, people like Elijah Harper, Phil Fontaine, Ovid Mercredi, Conrad Seawee, and we stopped the Meech Lake Accord here in Winnipeg. And it was a marvel and a triumph. And if anybody was there in the sunrise ceremonies with several thousand people greeting the sun, doing tobacco ceremonies, I was on the parliamentary stations talking about how the definitions of the fundamental characteristic of Canada, if it didn't include Indigenous peoples, it would be very sad. And I was really shocked that my country would make a definition of itself, the distinct society, and leave out Indigenous peoples. And it took 3 years, and it's well recorded in the history of Winnipeg here. I was in Winnipeg. I came yesterday to deliver this paper. It was going to be named 9/11 Human Rights and the Fraudulent War on Terror. Things changed quickly, and the paper I've delivered, which is really zipping around the internet right now, Bush League Justice. Should George W. Bush be arrested in Calgary, Alberta, to be tried for international crimes? I'm working closely with Splitting the Sky, who was made into one of the terrorists in the Gustafson Lake Indian War in 1995, when the Army came in, when they used landmines. The issues to address here are stupendous, really. The things that don't get talked about, and the betrayal of, or the gross professional misconduct of people in, for instance, venues like CanWest Global, not to mention CBC, who just don't live up to their professional ethics. Now, when I saw this situation with Lesley Hughes, I started to Google, and I found out it all went back to a certain blogger by the name of Blackrod. Blackrod has no name. Blackrod, nobody can tell me who this is. Is Blackrod, why does Blackrod, she, he, they, what has Blackrod got to hide? Maybe Blackrod is like a pedophile who doesn't want her name to be made public. When people, when a group, an individual hide their identity, try to destroy professional careers, the media then completely runs with it. Jonathan Kay picks it up, runs in the National Post. Next thing, we got a hysteria. We've got Stéphane Dion saying, whatever the Canadian Jewish Congress tells me to do, I will do. And then Jack Layton. Yes, I know Barry's vicar. I got a very nice email this morning from Barry's vicar. It says my article is a tour de force. I gave it yesterday at the University of Winnipeg. And I see the dean in the back. It was the first time I've been invited to do a distinguished lecture. And I was really surprised at the after the event incident that happened, that Lesley was there, Michael was there. So this black rod got the ear of the National Post, the Liberal Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada, no identity. So there's no accountability with it. On December 28th, Black Rod wrote an article about me in my trying to write about Lesley Hughes. And of course, when I write about these issues, I really bent over backwards to say, look, Winnipeg has like an awesome Jewish community, a Marxist, right-wing, left-wing, cultural. Like I grew up in Toronto. It's such a powerful thing. And man, we can talk like calmly, not like had to be yesterday. So this black rod, who is it? Like, let's find out. Yesterday I was shown this symbol after the lecture of a Nazi swastika, and I recognized it as an icon from the website Montreal 9/11 Truth. And I invite you to go to that site and see the movie that icon describes. I know that, I know Patrick Byron, who does that site, and I'm getting the 5-minute signal, but I just want to say that this amazing inability or unwillingness of the media to tell anything close to the truth. This book, I really wanted to talk about it, An Act of State by William F. Pepper. He was the lawyer for the King family in 1999-2000, where it was demonstrated in a court of law that Martin Luther King, one of the greatest Americans of their entire history, was murdered by the government, by the army. Comitas, what's it called? Comitas, Posse Comitas. The army was well involved, so it was a civil litigation, not criminal. It was suing somebody. So there was a jury. How many people know that there was a legal process, witnesses giving their testimony on the public record, and Martin Luther King, it's pretty official out of that, is murdered by the government. That wasn't reported in the media. It wasn't reported in the media that it was Kagame and the people who shot down the plane that started the genocide in Rwanda. It's the Rwanda Patriotic Front and Museveni, which is representing the Anglo-American mining interests. Like, Dallaire got it completely wrong. Dallaire, Kagame was the good guy in his estimation. What I'm saying is, because you don't get proper coverage by CanWest Global, because people like Blackrod can destroy professional reputations, because there's this professional negligence, malfeasance in agencies like the CanWest Global, which have so much power over us. You get 22-year-olds on the blog trying to tell the truth, amazing stuff about Julie Couillard or stuff, and this quest for 9/11 truth. Well, what about truth in a few other subjects? What about, so when that symbol came out of nowhere that had nothing to do with my presentation, and I'm asked to account for the symbol, and of course the woman who showed me the symbol, the first thing I said, is this Blackrod? She said, yeah. Like, who is Blackrod? Is Blackrod like a company? Is it a group of people? Is it, Blackrod took down Lesley Hughes. And Winnipeg, I'm sorry to say, there was a rather stunning degree of silence from the progressive community when that happened. And I am pretty proud that I stepped forward and wrote about it. And that is what Black Rod wrote about me. And I'm pretty proud of this paper. And you can easily find it on the internet. It's published by Paul Graham's and your group, Canadian Peace Alliance. And it's a real honor to be in your company, to see this wonderful, vital, activist community in Winnipeg. What an asset for the country. Join us. Pay attention to George Bush's visit and the legal issues that come up, the political issues. What about the war crimes of Stephen Harper? What about our own government's complicity through Cotter, through essentially bowing to the American military culture and subordinating Canadian sovereignty for that? So thank you very much for the honor and pleasure of being in your company.
So at this point, if there are any questions, please come to that mic over there. Remember, we said 30 seconds, and identify who you are. And
Hi, my name's Val Gaffrey, and I'm a member of Peace Alliance Winnipeg, and I'm an official 9/11 skeptic. I do not believe any official stories, and I back Anthony Hall 100%. I think we are being misled by the media, and that we need to investigate every expletive official story that we get. Okay, Colin Powell has said that terrorism is a part of doing globalization, a part of doing business in the world, and a part Americans are not going to stop doing. According to Nafeez Ahmed, terrorism is supported and funded by a multiplicity of states contiguous to the Eurasian continent, states and countries which are allied to the West, avid denials notwithstanding. And underneath this is a multiplicity of intelligence and military organizations that support terrorists. 9/11 was very fortuitous for the authors of the 3 neoconservative documents published prior to 9/11, who said,
Val, are you almost finished?
Yep. Their military plans for the control of the world's resources could not be achieved absent some catastrophic and cataclysm event, and 9/11 was that event, and we've seen it, Iraq and Afghanistan. And terrorism is a phony story. It's supported by, it's state-supported terrorism, and we'd better start realizing it if we want to stop these wars. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Malone Weinberg. I'm here today with the Winnipeg Indigenous People Solidarity Movement, which started off as Friends of Grassy Narrows. Grassy Narrows started a blockade after decades of being poisoned by mercury and having their traditional trap lines and lands clear-cut in 2002. There hasn't been so much cutting lately, and Abitibi has pulled out. Tonight we're doing a fundraiser for a woman named YWCA who has been charged for building a cabin on her traditional trap line, and it's part of her Aboriginal rights, and she's going to take it to the courts and fight it all the way, unless they drop it, because really there's very little case, because a cabin is very much part of a trap line. So we have tickets for tonight. I have a question for Anthony and Colleen or anyone else who wants to comment. By the way, I started your book and I'm waiting for the second one because it'll force me to finish the first one, because it's pretty thick tome, but thank you for writing it. My question is this. This year in Canada, with not as much notice as, let's say, happened in Australia, there was an apology in the Parliament in June to survivors of residential schools. It was an official apology and might have marked the turning of a corner. On the other hand, in the same time, Canada has been refusing to sign the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, along with about 4 other countries, and you can probably use your imagination to contextualize which countries would be most threatened by Indigenous rights: United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Russia, in case your imagination is already saturated, because there's lots to imagine. I want to ask you, Colleen especially, and Anthony, if you want to comment, if you think that there could still be progress that comes out of the apology for those who have survived residential schools in moving forward the colonialist, decolonizing discourse in Canada, or if you think that all these other things like the continued poisoning of Indigenous people in the tar sands in Alberta, or the refusal to sign the United Nations rights on Indigenous people, actually undermines those efforts of truth and reconciliation happening in Canada.
I recognize you.
Yes.
See, we've met before.
Yes, recently.
Yeah. Basically, I'm somewhat of an optimist. I mean, I go to a lot of events, you know. The other day I went to Niji-Makwa School in the North End, and I hung out with 50 of the greatest little brown kids ever, you know. They're growing up, and they're getting a lot of things that even me, you know, growing up a kid in the 80s in the North End didn't get. They're getting a sense of their culture, and they're growing strong. And you go to the U of W, and you go to the U of M, and you go to Red River College, and you see these Aboriginal people, and they're getting educated and strong. And I think the apology was a huge turning point, because finally people, generations of people, because residential school didn't just affect my grandma and my grandpa, it affected my parents, it affected me. And if you can have an apology, and you can say, all right, you know what, I can accept this apology and I can move forward. And I think that's happening. I'm really optimistic. And yeah, the land is still, you know, you talked about the oil sands, the tar sands. There's still all these fights going on, and it seems to be happening so slowly that we've been doing this for generations. But I have no doubt that we can do it. I think the important thing is building allegiances too, you know, with other groups of people, with people who are concerned about this too, with people understanding why we have these rights. You know, Indigenous people don't want to be higher up on the roster. We don't want special treatment. We want equal treatment. And I think that's really important. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. I'm pretty optimistic, I think. I think change is happening. It looks slow, it's under the surface, but it's happening.
The passage by the UN General Assembly of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you know, Canada really has a lot to do with the history of that. It was George Manuel who wrote a book, The Fourth World, and the next year founded an organization called World Council of Indigenous Peoples. So this internationalization of this issue, and we're talking about people who have treaties with the Crown, and that is an international type of instrument. And so the Canadian government, the US government, the Australian government, the New Zealand government, they're very worried about the internationalization of this. And it was a great moment of humiliation for our country, for the decent people in our country, that our government, led by Stephen Harper, voted against this Declaration on the Rights of Independence, part of the mandate of the UN to decolonize the world based on its founding in the Atlantic Charter. And of course, there's another story that didn't get reported, didn't get interpreted. As I see it, the apology leaves unaddressed the question that the boarding school period and what went on in the boarding school period classically fulfill the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. 1948, a great Polish Jew by the name of Raphael Lemkin invented this term genocide. And in the definition that eventually got in the law, it says one part of genocide is taking a group of the children from one group and transferring to another group. And it's very clear that that was going on long after 48 in Canada. And so the reality is Canada is a violator of the Genocide Convention, and we should have an international process rather than judges, officials in the system who are so implicated in the history of how this came to be. We've got to have people from outside. And it's not an issue of individuals being violated. A national identity was violated. And that is in the realm of international law. And that is what, you know, there are many issues in the world, like Eastern Congo, like Palestine, Israel. Like these, we have to treat international law. If the states won't take it seriously and actually live within the law, we're going to have to do this as the concept that we are the citizens of the world. And there is a jurisdiction that we can express not through states, because the states are so implicated in the violation of all these crimes. They are the instruments, but it's not really the states, it's the companies that the state is the front person for. And the war on terror is really an economic ploy to pump up a certain privatized terrorist economy and our terror economy. It's all about the money. It's all about the material relations, as a certain well-known founder of our social sciences tradition taught us. So is that sufficient?
I don't know. It's up to everyone. Miigwech, thank you.
Wait a second, Alon. What is the time and place again of your fundraiser?
There's going to be food available, pickerel dinner, music, spoken word, and Gwawich will be speaking about her rights at the Red Road Lodge, Main and Logan, 7 p.m. and on. Come before 8 if you want to get a bite.
Hi, my name is Natasha, and I'm a student here at the U of W. I have just a really quick question. When I moved out of my parents' house, I stopped watching a lot of TV, and I started getting my news from the internet. And one of the places I tend to get my news is from the Alex Jones website. And I heard, okay, good. And I heard about things like the RFID chip, and I heard that they were also trying to pass a bill that was making it illegal to take a picture of a police officer in Canada and in Europe. So I was wondering if you guys had heard about him or if you considered him a reliable source of information, and also I was wondering if that law had in fact passed, because my boyfriend and I were looking and we called up some people, I don't know, government officials that we thought maybe could answer this question, and they were like, oh, no, don't worry about it, whatever. So I was just curious if you guys knew anything about these things.
May I? Alex Jones, certainly a really interesting source of information that you can't get elsewhere. We'd also recommend Democracy Now! If you start listening or checking these things out routinely, you begin to seriously question your previous view of the world. Very quickly you get dissatisfied with the usual sources. It's ironic for me, and I can't help mentioning this, is that I had 2 planks in my platform. One was for a national public newspaper for Canada, which I still see as a good thing and a possibility. It would be a kind of a printed or possibly electronic equivalent to the CBC. It would be a source of information that is nonpartisan, highly political, obviously, but nonpartisan, and it would be operated by professional journalists, the best professional journalists, and we have many in the country who operate under uncomfortable restrictions. And this would be completely free of government and corporate influence. And the reason being that this would change our view of the country, of each other, and of the world in very short order. I would give it 6 months, because this is an intelligent, progressive, urban country for the most part. I can't help mentioning that because what you've been talking about is how you have experienced another source of information and how it's changed you. It's interesting to me because I hadn't heard about this effort to make it illegal to take the picture of a police officer, and I wish I knew whether that was true. I do know a couple of things that I've picked up from similar sources that if we had a national public newspaper, Canadians would know about. You know, one of them being that in the States it's now legal, it's entirely legal to arrest foreign citizens, including Canadian nationals, if they are suspected of committing or intending a crime against the United States on hearsay evidence. On hearsay evidence. It's the last 4 words that scare the bejesus out of me, right? So you see what that means, and we happily rush down there on lots of occasions to do our shopping and don't think about that. I understand it's also in the States, it's considered illegal to kidnap citizens of other countries, if in other countries, if they are similarly suspected of committing these crimes. These are small things in the minds of some, but I think things that we ought to know, because how can we know how to respond if we don't? So I hope you carry on with what you're doing. And in the meantime, does anybody here know whether it's legal to take a picture of a police officer in Winnipeg?
The law that you're referring to is a law in Britain, and I think it's currently in front of the House of Commons in Britain. The law would say that it's illegal to take a photograph of a police officer or a member of the military in any kind of setting. And about 2 weeks ago, journalists in London had a mass demonstration outside Scotland Yard where they, the objective of the demonstration was they just took photographs of Scotland Yard. It's on BBC. You can get some news about it on the BBC website, the CBC, and I think we carried a report on the Peace Alliance website about it. I don't believe it's law yet, but it is something they propose. And the kind of circumstances you could see it happening is in any kind of large action, if you think of what happened in Quebec when there was the summit in Quebec, or Seattle, or the upcoming summit in Strasbourg with NATO, that if something happened and the police started to engage with the demonstrators, that it would, under those circumstances, if you were taking pictures of the police, yes, you could be put in, under the law, if the law was to be enacted, you would be subject to being put in jail as a penalty.
Or tasered. Thank you.
I just wanted to, sound in on this. I'm not personally a big fan of the Alex Jones show, to tell you the truth. I find that there's very much of a scaremongering aspect to it. And I find that while there's a lot of information there that is fairly accurate and provocative, there's also disinformation on that site, I believe. I am personally, for instance, he promotes the idea that climate change is not.
I was kind of like,
and
sure about
peak
that.
oil, and there's a lot of other issues out there that I feel that he's been criticized by other journalists as not doing proper sourcing, and I think that we should recall that there is a famous saying by Peter Dale Scott that the best disinformation is 90% accurate. So it's a real dilemma trying to figure out the way the world works. It's the unfortunate thing is you really have to do a lot of research and you have to question everything. I could probably direct you to sources that I think are more or less accurate, but I mean, I don't necessarily want to tell you, well, you got to do this or you got to do that. I think that, but I think it's very important that somebody with a track record, that maybe steer away from people who start making predictions that this is when there's going to be an attack on Iran or whatever like that. Just try to be rigorous and examine everything with an open yet skeptical mind.
Who is some people like?
Well, okay, there's one website that I tune in from time to time. It's globalresearch.ca. That's the site of the Michelle Chossudovsky, the Center for Research on Globalization, which publishes a lot of well-sourced information there. There's also the Guerrilla News Network. I would also probably recommend the lifeaftertheoilcrash.net, which goes into peak oil, the peak oil issue. Which actually takes a lot of information from mainstream sources, but it helps puts them in a certain context. Actually, a lot of mainstream. I think another site you should probably keep in mind with regard to the 9/11 issue, which was brought up earlier, cooperativeresearch.org. This is a site that takes where a lot of people will introduce items from verifiable press reports and send them to this site, and it will basically help fill out the details. I mean, it talks about 9/11 and the implausibility of the 9/11 Commission report, and it bases it on the kind of information. I mean, like Lesley in the infamous article that she wrote, which was sourced, and she did mention the sources tentatively, and you can find that there are many more sources backing up what she's saying. So I think that just try to, it's a catalog that's all made up of issues that, of sources that have yet to be discredited. So,
Yeah,
Does that answer your?
If I can add to that is, I think if you can concentrate more at home right now, what's happening, that you guys can be involved in. The person that I want to mention about is Abdul Razik, who is stuck in Sudan right now. He's a Canadian citizen since 2004. He has not been found guilty of anything or charged of anything. Even the Sudanese government is saying, take him home, we'll buy his ticket. He's sitting in the embassy and he's been blocked by the Canadian government from coming back to Canada. And this is a case that we as Canadians should be standing up for. The second, of course, is Omar Khadr. I mean, he was a child soldier, which I just found out that one of our government officials, when was asked about it, said, oh, child soldier, I thought child soldiers were only Africans. So that's the extent of our information, and he is sitting, and we have been asking for him to be brought back, and if he, tried in the Canadian courts if he has to be. These are the cases which directly impact our civil liberties right here in Canada, and I think we have not heard much about it, and I agree with my friend that the Winnipeg community, which is known for its passion for civil liberties and human rights and so forth, has not been as vocal and as organized as we need to be, because we get sidetracked by many other things. But these are the issues right now at home. The 5 under the secret evidence, there are 5 Canadians that are being held right now without charges for indefinite time. This is the process of law, and once you can take away the due process of law, or you can compromise it for any state in any country, that is the beginning of the end. Because today it may be the Muslims and the Arabs, tomorrow it could be anyone else. So I think pay attention to what is happening right under our noses, because it is impacting our future. And if we don't pay attention. Now, honestly, I think right after 2001, I was in this forum talking about what we fear could happen, and people, oh no, not in Canada. It has happened. Okay? And it is being done with impunity. Politicians are standing up and saying, so what? I mean, that is the extent of normalizing the compromise of due process of law and human rights and civil liberties. So I think it's important that we pay attention right here at home.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Hi. I'm kind of worried that none of you will take on my question, but anyway. My name is Pejanakut. I am the Ogima Khan of the Free Ojibwe, the few and the proud, the modern faith keepers of the Anishinaabe Nation. In 2003, I considered myself a patriot of Canada. I desperately wanted to contribute, to make positive contributions to Canada. But in 2005, I became a separatist because of all the harassment from the common Canadian and discrimination from Canadian businesses and organizations. So I define a patriot as a person who abides by their Constitution and will defend their Constitution. So being that multiculturalism is part of the Canadian Constitution, I believe that the common Canadian who engages in harassment or other discriminatory action is in fact an enemy of the state, weakening the country. In my case, they drove me to want to become a separatist. So my question to any of you is, do you agree or disagree that the common racist person in Canada should be considered an enemy of the state? And if you do agree or disagree, why? No one wants to take it on, eh?
Could you repeat that, please?
What, the whole thing?
Just the question part.
Just do you agree or disagree that you can consider the common racist in Canada an enemy of the state because of the fact that they are not abiding by the Constitution, that they are weakening our multicultural society by driving wedges between the people?
Well, the problem with that premise is that the state adheres to the law. And there's no evidence that the state is anywhere near adhering to the law, enforcing the law. The law is for street people in places like Winnipeg. The law is for poor people. I mean, everything proves that the law is to defend the property of the rich from the incursions of the poor. And even if we have statements like, say after the Civil War, the statements to free the slave, that everybody has the right of life, liberty, and possession of property, I think it was. And then that was used to say that corporations are persons and they have equal rights. So even when we get these bold statements of high-sounding idealism, the people who have the money to purchase the legal talents to make the case. So it just becomes totally demoralizing living in a state where does the state recognize and affirm Aboriginal and treaty rights? I mean, I've been in court talking about this for 22 days. Like, there's in our Constitution, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed, Section 35 of Constitution Act 1982. Who is doing this affirming and recognizing of Aboriginal peoples? When you go to court, there is the Crown, the representative of Her Majesty, always denying and negating. So the average Canadian, I'd say, these are our people, these are our citizens. And if there is racism among us, we all have to deal with this. None of us have really can say, we are without our issues of group thinking, and we see patterns in life. So I would say, no, it's the state that has a problem with adhering to the law, and it's our fellow citizens that we have to reach out to, including in the police. And, appeal to people in the police. You're just a political force. You don't uphold the law. We said that on the train tracks at Long Lake 58 in 1990. You're supposed to be upholding Aboriginal and treaty rights. Who's ever gone to court for violating an Aboriginal and treaty right? Who's ever gone to jail for violating an Aboriginal treaty right? In the streets of Winnipeg, a dark-skinned person makes one little infraction. The police are on, so phone Crime Stoppers and say, I want to report a violation of a treaty right. What a disgrace that we have these treaties that are the basis of our sovereignty, our land, our relationship to the land. And the government says, you got your $5, now move along. You got your $5 for your treaty right. And we won't talk about the treaties, we'll talk about the Indian Act, which is totally in violation of Section 35. The Indian Act has nothing to do with recognizing and affirming Aboriginal and treaty rights. The Indian Act is obviously unconstitutional. So it's the state that's the problem, and it's the people that are the answer. And rather than condemning your average Canadian as racist, which might be perfectly justifiable, we've got to try to love one another, try to get together and talk through our differences and deal with a lawless state that spits on our Constitution. Thank you.
I just want to make one last little point. I want to call somebody the enemy of the state, so I'm going to call the government the enemy of the state.
I just want to add something there. You called yourself a separatist, but you're not really a separatist. You're a sovereigntist. You're a tribal sovereigntist. You're part of something that predates Canada, and that is why the treaties were signed in the first place. Miigwech.
I'm Steve Schaefer. I want to ask a question of all of you, a question concerning the internet, and I want to make a couple of comments leading up to it. First of all, I came to Canada in 1974. I became a Canadian citizen actually only recently. There's a lot of flaws in what's happening in Canada and our government, but I think we are a democracy that is phenomenal compared with many other places in the world. And we have serious problems, and I agree with those of you who have said that we, as individuals, as well as groups, need to do something about it. And my question relates to that. I'm concerned, for instance, Lesley Hughes, you mentioned Democracy Now! I've gone to Democracy Now!, and I have to say that I'm very concerned about Democracy Now! Expressing very one-sided opinions. And my concern goes way beyond Democracy Now! Many, many websites on the internet express one side. That's their right, I guess, but they do express opinions rather than facts. They present sometimes facts, but they're one-sided, so they leave out an awful lot, and it leaves those of us who are reading from their websites real questions as to, is it accurate, is it completely the facts? I think in regard to your comment about Black Rod, yeah, Black Rod doesn't identify who they are, but on the other hand, the hundreds of thousands of comments and blogs on the internet don't identify themselves other than by some code. We never know who they are. So, most people will put down I can't what they're called, but they don't put down their actual name. So you don't know who they are when they're making these comments. What I'd like to know is your thoughts on what we can do as individuals in regard to what is happening on the internet, in regard to how the internet is influencing us and our human rights. And that includes our right to privacy, which the internet is moving more and more into intruding upon.
Lesley, can I call on you to start that?
Thanks. That's a really big question. I mentioned an earlier plank about the National Public Newspaper. Another plank was the importance of making sure that the internet is not privatized and doesn't become like the cable system, which operates on a meter, more or less, and which prohibits all kinds of democratic outbursts, and that can be quite wonderful. I mean, the internet is it's a nightmare and it's a dream come true at the same time. I think what we need to do is make absolutely sure that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we've already talked about today, that it applies to the internet as well as to other forms of media. But even as I say that, I recognize that other forms of media have all kinds of privileges and all kinds of ways of abusing their power that ordinary people cannot respond to. Because it's one thing to say, and it's said on the internet all the time, the mainstream media does a poor job, and then alas, you discover that the internet also does a very poor job. And there is a tendency, as you pointed out, to substitute opinion for fact. And if someone in the mainstream media finds an opinion that they like, they can then report it as fact, which can be devastating, as I've personally discovered. So this question of how do we make the internet accountable is a tough one, given that the mainstream media aren't really accountable, except to people who have bags and bags and bags of money, because the only way usually to pursue inaccurate or malicious stories is through the justice system, which, as we know, costs a lot of money. So how do we rescue the internet when we haven't even rescued mainstream media? I'm glad you introduced the question, and I hope smarter people than me are working on that even as we speak.
I really would want to address this question. I went to get a newspaper, something I brought with me. I got this book done when I was 52 years old, and I felt I was pretty young to have done it. The Volume 2 on the final stages, it's called Earth into Property. Volume 1 is the American Empire in the Fourth World. And I must say, like yesterday, pulling something off the internet a picture and waving it around. You know, when you've put a lifetime into your scholarship and, you know, suddenly, well, I saw a picture on the internet that I found hurtful. Well, yeah, it's a free-for-all out there, but the anonymity on the internet, like this is blogs published in the National Post about my article about Lesley Hughes. So this article over here is an article describing my article about Lesley Hughes. Then the way it's played out is that the National Post, they take on the 9/11 conspiracy theorists, and they publish anonymous bloggers. So here I am, I have a name, you can see me, my name is Anthony Hall, and I'm taking responsibility for what I say. I'm a professional person. Now, if Blackrod is going to attack my professional credentials, that the person, the group, the contractors should take responsibility, you know, accountability. And the National Post here is, you know, let me just read Panona 71, a completely unidentified person says, the 9/11 conspiracy theorists, like creationist theorists and those who think Elvis is alive, will never change their views. A conspiracy fits into their distorted view of the world. Fortunately, there are plenty of websites that show these people for the fools they are. If Professor Anthony J. Hall is adding weight to the skeptic side, they are in trouble. Now, fine. That's fine, it's fair game, but not from an anonymous person, and not from a venue like this who protects the identity of this mudslinging and names me by name. And so the significance of Blackrod being able to tell the National Post what to say, tell the Liberal Party what to do, the NDP Party, the Conservative Party, the Government of Canada, which I saw and traced it out on the Lesley Hughes matter, that's a huge responsibility. And the fact that this can be done by an anonymous person and nobody in the media where it's all about going to your sources. Well, what are your sources? Well, it's Blackrod. Well, who is Blackrod? Well, it's a blogger, and bloggers don't have to have the name, like Mr. Schaefer said. Everybody, yeah, sure, I'm a rap rock prof on the internet. Like, I know that people have pseudonyms or whatnot, but on a professional level, when you set out to destroy somebody's professional career, and you can do that anonymously, and nobody even asks, that is a disgraceful. The people responsible for that, the Jonathan Kays, poor Stéphane Dion, but Peter Kent was the worst. He's saying all the people who ask questions about 9/11 are notorious for their anti-Semitism. So this is talking about a group of people. Fine, say Lesley Hughes, you said this and this and this. Tony Hall, you said this and this and this. But to say all people who ask about this type of issue or this issue are racists and bigots, because to be called anti-Semitic in this society is a tough thing. It's you know, that's a hard thing to carry. And okay, so 9/11, why it's so essential that we pay attention to this is because it gives justification to something called the War on Terror. The War on Terror is based on a very particular interpretation of the events of 9/11. And it's based on an interpretation that says it's 18 people with box cutters who planned this in Afghanistan and Pakistan in dark caves. And it's just not a credible, it hasn't got a shred of credibility anymore. So to say that we'll deal with the illegalities of the invasion of Afghanistan, of what's going on in Iraq, the Patriot Act, the this and the that, and we'll spread all our energies around all these things being done in the name of a fraudulent interpretation of 9/11. And we have people like David Ray Griffin, Peter Dale Scott. It's very well documented. Like, when I come to a university, I expect my colleagues to have done some homework. Yeah, and rather than go to a website and show me a picture of a swastika and say, what do you think of this? Isn't this offensive? Yeah, it's offensive.
Michael, just briefly.
I'll try to be very brief. There's, and on this question of the reliability of what you see on the internet and so on, I see this as a double-edged sword, if you will. I think that maybe one of the ways to navigate around that, I'm actually speaking as somebody who's sort of in media. I actually host a program on CUPE 95.9 FM Tuesday mornings from 8 till 9. And I know there's Alert Radio, there are other alternative media out there. I think what we have to do is recognize that there are opportunities for these different media to sort of interact with each other, and that you can assess the reliability of what you read by looking at the people who are presenting and see what kind of a track record they have. And they can establish for themselves enough of a reputation that you can become a little bit more confident in what you're saying. I don't know if that's what I can say about that.
Okay. We have 3 people who want to ask questions. We've got about 10 minutes left, so please,
Keep it short.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Arlene Macklem. I'm co-chair of the Human Rights Committee for CUPE Manitoba, and CUPE stands for Canadian Union of Public Employees. And just a correction, because someone asked me at the table, they said, oh, I heard about CUPE and dealing with the Gaza issue. And we have, just to clear things up, a certain member of our group publicly came forward, and it was published in the papers about not hiring Israeli professors in the universities and this type of thing. CUPE structure is such that every province is run autonomously, that they don't have to follow the national policies. So this person does not speak for all of CUPE. We believe CUPE National, and myself personally, believe that there can be a peaceful solution in Gaza, and we abhor any violence, any war, and that's what we work towards. And I'd just like to say about the current government that we have, and a lot of you have alluded to that, and it seems to be, well, the ultra-right-wing agenda of our current government, while they've gone in, they've not signed the Aboriginal Accord, they didn't sign the Kyoto Accord. They've used this opportunity to slam women in many, many ways, with the cancellation of the child care program, with cutting back a lot of the government programs for women, and it seems to be a permanent attack on women and where they would like us to be. And as a white woman, of course, it's going to be different. You know, I've been discriminated against for being a woman, but, you know, we understand very well that, you know, if you're an Aboriginal woman or a black woman or an immigrant woman, that your paycheck and your status and so on goes down even further. And I'd just like to ask, you know, what do you think of our government and their concerns with women, or lack of concerns with women?
Don't get me started. That is a question for another conference.
Yes.
Which I hope will happen. I think we missed this International Women's Day. But yeah, it's disgraceful. I'm sorry, I won't elaborate because we've only got 10 minutes and there's people patiently waiting to put other questions to us. But I think your perception is a very popular one, if not, in fact, a consensus.
Hi, my name is Jeremy, and I just wanted to clarify some comment made by Ms. Siddiqui. I believe you made reference to organizations in Canada losing funding for being critical of Israel. I don't know if you saw the Margaret Wente piece about a week ago on the Canadian Arab Federation. It was my understanding from reading the article and from talking to other people and other sources that the Canadian Arab Federation applied for and received a federal grant under the guise of fighting racism, and then proceeded to launch a website which incited hatred against Jews, and I understand that the RCMP is investigating that. So my comment is that I don't think that the Canadian Arab Federation lost their funding for being critical of Israel. I think they lost their funding because tax dollars are a privilege and they're not a right. And no one takes issue with the Canadian Arab Federation's right to voice their opinion, but I think I speak for most people here when I say that we don't want to use our tax dollars to incite hatred against any group. So thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Gore. I want to have a personal question for each and one of you, and I'm pretty sure this fellow pointed out just in the beginning about
Gordon, sorry, Shahina wanted to reply to the last question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was commenting on the comments of the minister. Anti-Semitism, whether it's the hatred of Jews in whatever form, is not acceptable. His words were exactly that. It was not just talking about CAF, he was also talking about the Canadian Muslim Congress. So they were based on his comments. If they promote hatred, I would have to look into it because this is the first time hearing of it. And the funding that they got was for the integration of refugees and immigrants coming from Arab countries, and that is what the funding was for. The point it made was that if you are going to hold, when you talk about freedom of expression, minus the hate, don't apply it selectively. Because I can give you 101 examples of hatred against Muslims and Islam being put forward by organizations that are funded by the government, okay? But that is a double standard there. So when a minister makes comments like that, and he actually did say critical of Israel, okay? And also, when we start mixing anti-Semitism with everything else on the political agenda, we do a disservice to anti-Semitism, okay? Because it is clear what it is, but don't mix it up because you take away from its strength and from the suffering of those because of whose suffering this came forward, okay?
Now I can ask.
Thank you, sorry.
You mentioned earlier about the RFID chips. There's going to come a time when people are going to have to answer yes and no. Like I believe in standing for humanity in general, not just for rights, humanity in general. And it's going to come a time, and thank goodness for my predicament, that I already I made an attempt just to check it out. They said about the $50 to pay for the driver's license. Well, because I'm on parole, I'm not allowed to have this thing for going across the borders, and that probably saved my life. So when it comes to time, I'm going to say no to RFID chip, microchip. And then there's one question I have to every one of you: is are you going to accept, or are you going to accept or refuse the RFID?
I will not accept the RFID chip myself, and I don't intend to have this enhanced driver's license, which is, for now, is voluntary. I think that this is playing into this whole surveillance society, which is essentially about ultimately, tracking people, and I think that we should reject it. Okay, there's absolutely no rationale for this. This is not about protecting citizens. It's about controlling them, and it's about propping up what I think. The umbrella that I was trying to communicate in my presentation is that what we're seeing here is a society in which we are granting more power to these authoritative entities, and we're giving it up willingly because we're so scared of these terrorists, and we're so scared of the rogue states. And in fact, I just want to briefly mention something. This is from the Chossudovsky book. There was a July 2004 report of the Homeland Security Council entitled Planning Scenarios, and what it lists is that scenarios in which there's something called a universal adversary, and they list among the universal adversaries what they're conducting these simulations. It is inclusive of the following categories: foreign Islamic terrorists, domestic radical groups, including anti-war and civil rights groups, state-sponsored adversaries, including rogue states and unstable nations, and disgruntled employees, including labor and union activists. Okay, these are all falling under the category of fighting a war on terrorism, okay? So I think we have to be very vigilant, and we have to deeply question, is this the key to our security, to grant this authoritative power to these governments and cabinet ministers and high-ranking military and police officials, and trust that they're going to be looking out for our interests? There have to be checks and balances, because this drive, this scare, we've seen it throughout history. We move in this direction of increased surveillance, in monitoring. We're playing into the hands of the, those people who are looking to control us and do not necessarily have our best interests at heart. So that's my concern.
Last question.
Yes, well, I'd certainly like to thank everyone for participating. I've really enjoyed listening to the panel. Thank you very much for that. And if I am the last question, it's a bit of information that then you can respond to that. I'm sure most of the people in this room are familiar with Congressman Ron Paul. It probably isn't from reading what you're reading in the newspapers in Canada, but if you're on the net, you know about him. And this question deals with the mainstream media filtration of what we, the public, get. And recently I did a news alert for the New York Times for Congressman Ron Paul. And, excuse me, when I did that news alert search, there was no mention of Congressman Ron Paul in the New York Times in 90 days. There's been 0 articles, if you could believe that, in the New York Times. That is not an accident, that is filtration. And I would appreciate your comments to such a phenomena of non-mention of an important American figure.
Who would like to take that?
I'll just start very briefly. The New York Times, I believe, has already apologized to its readers for supporting the headlong rush of war into Iraq, because it was a key figure in justifying that initiative, and has made an abject apologies to readers for that. I just would like to say that it has a lot more to apologize for which it has not apologized, and probably won't apologize, even as it goes down the capitalist tube. But I think it's wise of you to bring it to our attention. Did you want to add something, Tony?
There's just no words profound enough to express what the internet, how it's changed everything and transformed everything. And at the time of this tremendous sort of mind control in the mainstream media, it's the same time as the internet is now giving us amazing access. To me, it's one of the good news stories of my lifetime, that little guy gets to speak, but how you get the skills to be able to actually use its power, use the power of Google, that's another matter. Now YouTube, have you seen the videos of the concentration camps being built in Western North America? You hear these things and you say, this just sounds like, this really does sound too far out there. Like, over the summer I'm seeing people are having all these spottings of train cars with shackles. So you Google in train cars, shackles, and boom, FEMA, Rex 84, continuity of government, Peter Dale Scott. But I think it was the most troubling thing I ever saw, about a 20-minute YouTube where you would just go by it. You would go by it in a train. You would see some fences. You would see some warehouses. You wouldn't put it together in your mind. But the filmmaker takes you around, through the entry gates and shows like the fence where it's to keep people in. And it looks like it's warehouses. And there's actually incineration facilities, which I take it would be to incinerate the bodies. And the thing, this sounds so crazy, and it does sound like, but go to YouTube and look at it. So the very idea that we had text, but now suddenly, just in the last few months really, we can see with our own eyes these things. But how you go about like teaching in a university, for instance, where we've all been taught certain rules about how you do research and how you invent specialties and the experts in their field, like it changes the landscape of knowledge. And so I'd like to say, I'd like to do video conferences. On Wednesday, I will be in University of Waterloo. You can watch the video conference I'll be doing with my colleagues on globalizationstudies.ca. The subject is disinformation, state terror, and resistance from Gaza, from 9/11 to Gaza. Graham McQueen, Professor McQueen, I've been working with him on it. So the importance of realizing that we do have the ability to change our orientation, and this is something that gives a possibility for human liberation, for free knowledge. We share it. It's a gift-giving economy. We don't, we don't sell it. We love we're human. We love to exchange on this. So, I invite us to get beyond these names that we use to describe each other, as if to say Muslim, anti-Semite, native, separatist, sovereigntist. But the time has come. The economy is broken, as Art Solomon used to say. The money is broken. This is the moment. This is the moment when, as people, we have the opportunity to reach out to each other in a loving, compassionate, mutually respectful and edifying way, and not give each other these labels. So the internet is beyond saying, well, now we can know about Ron Paul. But isn't it interesting how much of Ron Paul has been predicting is exactly coming true? I mean, the Federal Reserve Board and the games being played there and the free money being handed out to all the cronies, including in Canada. It is a time where these are not normal times. This is a time when people have to join together, love one another, share with one another, not call each other names and sandbag each other and try to trap each other.
So with that, I'd like to again thank our panelists and invite everybody to stay for refreshments and to see what the various organizations have brought on their tables. Thank you.
Thank you.